It is now time for a special interview here on Morning Wave in Busan. Well, 20 days of lethal heat per year, collapsed ecosystems, and more than 1 billion people displaced. These are all probable scenarios that could devastate societies by 2050 if swift and dramatic action is not taken to curb climate change. This is a thought that's being publicized right now. Let's speak to our expert on hand, Dr. David Spratt, Research Director for Breakthrough National Center for Climate Restoration, Melbourne, and co-author of the book Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action. Hi, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, good morning.
Yeah, so first of all, if you could please introduce to us what the National Center for Climate Restoration, what it is and what it does?
This is a non-government organisation based in Melbourne, Australia. It's a think tank. Our concern is with climate change and the fact that we are now facing a climate emergency. This is a term that we now see increasingly being used. I noticed that Pope Francis 2 days ago made some statements after meeting with leading business people talking about the climate emergency. An emergency in the sense that climate change, if it keeps on going, will get to the stage where it will overwhelm society and really requires an emergency response. I mean, like a typhoon, like a cyclone, like a rapid bushfire, but long term. So our aim is to provide some ideas, leadership, some new thinking about the climate emergency and how we might respond to it.
I see. Well, a recent report from your organization has become a hot topic all over the world, including here in Korea, many media outlets reporting on it. So tell us about this report and what it contains.
Okay, so this report received an enormous amount of publicity, more than we expected.
Sure.
Some of the reporting has been a little over the top and said things that we didn't say. I mean, there's been reporting saying that we said that humans as a species would come to an end. We never said that.
I see.
What we said was that if climate change just continues on the present path, it will become a threat to human civilization, that is, to the culture, the politics, the society that we've known. So the report has 3 parts. The first part is to look at risk, and it says when we think about risks and how to manage risks, we shouldn't just look at the middle of the range of the possibilities. We should look at the worst case. Sensible risk management is to say, what's the worst thing that can happen and how can we prevent it? If you think about aeroplanes, what's the worst thing that could happen to an aeroplane and how to prevent it? So that's the first point.
Okay.
The second point is to say, okay, so where are we heading now? And people know that countries made some commitments in Paris in 2015 to reduce their emissions.
Yes.
If the world doesn't do any better than those current emissions, if we continue on the Paris path as it is, we will get to 3 degrees of warming. We're currently about 1.1, but we will get to 3 degrees. We said 2050, maybe 2060 or a bit later. So our second point is to look at 3 degrees and say this is going to be really, really severe and will really produce a lot of social and political dislocation. And then the third part of the story is to say, well, how should the national security, the military, the intelligence people respond to this? And our conclusion is that if we get to that situation in 2050 or 60, this will not have a military solution. It will be too overwhelming for them. There are no military national security solutions when climate change gets this bad. So we think the military have really a lot of expertise in mobilisation, in devoting resources, in planning and responding to emergencies, developing technologies, developing skills to deal with problems. We think that they need to spend some of their time reorienting about how to stop this problem, because if it gets really bad, we don't think that they can solve it.
Well, speaking of that really bad scenario, if we look at the worst case, if the Earth's overall temperature rises by more than 3 degrees Celsius by 2050, Earth will apparently be in this hot house state. What would that look like?
Well, this was a famous scientific paper that came out last year by some of the world's leading climate scientists. There are two sorts of climate change impacts. The ones that we see as you put more greenhouse gases in the air, for example, warmer temperatures, we get stronger winds because the sea surface temperature is warmer. We get heavier rain, all those things we know. Then there are other things which might be called system changes, which are not linear, which is more difficult to predict. For example, does it get warm enough to melt a lot of northern Europe, what's called permafrost, ground which is permanently frozen with carbon? And if that melts, so much carbon comes up. That could come out of the Earth, the system would start to run away. And these people said, when could these sort of things happen? Another one would be the Amazon rainforest, which is an enormous store of carbon being really badly affected with drought and fire and coming back in a different form. And they said, well, look, from 2 degrees onwards, we could have this thing where essentially the system would keep on driving warming up. The climate system will keep on driving warming up, even if we stopped emitting things. So that's a big issue that we really have to avoid, what's called those big tipping points, where the system literally jumps from one step to another.
I see. Well, as we are human beings, we tend to be a bit selfish. So I want to ask you, how would this affect Asia or Asian cities, especially cities like ours? We're, on a peninsula along the coast. What about rising sea levels?
Well, look, this is obviously the biggest story. A couple of years ago, we toured to Australia, perhaps the leading person in the United States on these national security issues, a woman called Sherry Goodman. And we were having dinner one night when she arrived, and we were describing what the impacts in Asia would be in Australia, the Pacific, obviously because we have Pacific Islands, and she looked at us and said, you're living in disaster alley. And that was her phrase for Australia, Asia, and the Pacific. So obviously we have and we actually produced a report for Breakthrough called Disaster Alley about climate change and risk. And obviously we have the biggest populations in the world in Asia. We have in India and China, two of the most water-starved countries in the world in terms of water insecurity. Yes. Also in places like Pakistan. You have the most vulnerable, sizable population country to inundation in Bangladesh. The former head of the Bangladesh military says if we have a 1 metre sea level rise, that will inundate 20% of the land area of Bangladesh and displace 30 million people. Wow. You have and India has built the world's first climate refugee fence on the whole of the Pakistan-India border, literally a barbed wire fence to stop people moving from Bangladesh to India. So there's a very big national security issue. And of course in Asia, as you know, we have a lot of very low-lying cities. The city of Jakarta in Indonesia is going to have to be moved because it's sinking. And you know that that Mumbai or Shanghai or big cities in the Philippines, right along that coastline, you have cities very vulnerable. And then, of course, you have the world's biggest, some of the world's biggest and richest river deltas. For example, in Vietnam, the Mekong is the food bowl. Is the food bowl of Vietnam, and already we're seeing on the lower parts of the Mekong, they are starting to turn some rice paddies into prawn farming because the water is becoming so salinated. So, this is an issue that will literally, I think, transform life in every part of Asia, which I said I think is because of its population, the biggest story in climate change in the world.
I see. Well, also according to the report, the 2020s and 2030s will become these so-called tipping points. So what does this exactly mean? You mentioned tipping point before.
Well, I think there's a political tipping point. There's some research come out recently which said that if the world has since it agreed in the early 1990s to set up international political processes to deal with climate change, which led to these climate talks, which have been going on forever. Since that process started, the world now puts up 50% more emissions each year than when it started. So we are heading really in the wrong direction still. And research says that if we do not bend that curve down, if we do not actually start to tip emissions down very quickly and well before 2030, they said if at 2030 we haven't bent that emissions curve down, then 3 degrees of warming is pretty much inevitable. And that is, that would be terrible. That would be terrible. Yes. So really the next 10 years right now is the time where we have to make decisions and take actions that will determine the future of people for many generations to come.
And now we need to get to the crux of all of this is what should be done to reduce those carbon levels, to reduce the risks so we don't get to that point.
Well, look, there are several things we need to do. A very significant amount of the greenhouse gases going there come from the continued destruction of forests around the world. We absolutely have to stop deforestation, and I think that means some rich countries, I mean, like the one I come from, Australia in particular, should actually pay for countries which are engaged in deforestation to stop doing so. We can't expect them just to do it of themselves. There has to be a proper program to stop that. The second thing is we have got to stop using fossil fuels. So the first thing I would say is we should have no new fossil fuel investment. We've got an Indian company, Adani, which is about to build one of the world's largest coal mines in Australia. It is scandalous. We have to stop making the problem worse.
Yes.
That means no new fossil fuel infrastructure. And then, of course, we need to get off our addiction to fossil fuels as quickly as possible. In a country like Australia, it is now very clear that in terms, for example, of generating electricity, that wind farms and solar energy are now cheaper than existing coal or new coal. So the technological change has already happened in terms of energy. We can see the same thing with cars and vehicles now. Where in China, for example, I mean, they're deploying very large numbers of electric buses. We have the technological and economic capacity to do this. What we seem to lack is the social and political will.
Yes. Well, definitely you gave us a lot of to think about and to ponder. So thank you so much for coming on air with us and explaining the situation and things we can do to
thank you very
go
much.
In the right direction.
My pleasure.
Once again,
bye.
Once again, this was Dr. David Spratt, the research director for the Breakthrough National Center for Climate Restoration in Melbourne. And he mentioned a couple things that I do want to go over real quick, things that we can do to bring those emission levels down. We're going to have to watch the next 10 years very closely in terms of the greenhouse gases. Stop deforestation, stop using fossil fuels, and thirdly, to use alternative sources instead of those fossil fuels, something that we as lay people can put pressure on our politicians and leaders to work towards this singular goal of preserving Earth and, of course, human civilization. All right, here's our next song. This is by Ringo Starr, It Don't Come Easy.